Hello and welcome to the 2025 MIFF Schools program. I'm Josh Nelson, and on behalf of all of the team at MIFF, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all live, learn and work, and to pay our respects to their elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Here at MIFF, we continue to celebrate the history and contemporary creativity of the world's oldest living culture. As those of you familiar with the MIFF Schools programs from previous years will no doubt already be aware, these presentations have been created as an educational resource for teachers and students, providing an overview of each film text, suggesting strategies for analysis and topics for classroom discussion, and tying together aspects from the films to the various assessment criteria found within the language courses offered under VCAR, and also to subjects such as English and EAL, literature, media studies, and the film study course for the International Baccalaureate. In each of those curriculums, there's a real key focus on developing students' visual literacy skills and encouraging students to critically engage with media texts across a range of contexts and mediums. And this obviously becomes a really key component of assessment as students progress into their final years of the VCE. So for that reason, film analysis will be a key focus of these presentations, not as a replacement or as a substitute for the focus on language and cultural aspects, but rather as something that can sit side by side those key focus areas. While the MIFF Schools program is perhaps ideally suited to students within the French, Japanese, Mandarin, Italian, German and English language courses, the selected films in this year's program offer opportunities for study and classroom analysis across a really diverse range of subjects, abilities and age groups, preparing students, as I mentioned, for those text-based assessments and really developing those visual literacy skills. Now, I'm going to focus on the film techniques and terminologies that students would ideally have a familiarity with in just a moment. But before I do that, here a brief synopsis of the film might be useful. Now, I should mention, this will be a relatively spoiler-free presentation. I'm going to avoid, as much as possible, giving away any crucial plot details or revelations within the films themselves, while still providing you with an overview of the content of the film and suggesting some strategies and suggestions for analysis that should really help structure that post-screening and pre-screening classroom discussion and context. Greetings from Mars is a German language film centering around Tom, a 10-year-old living with his widowed mum and his two teenage siblings, who dreams of becoming an astronaut and piloting a mission to Mars. While mathematically gifted, he also struggles with any deviations from his set routine and is particularly sensitive to extreme sensory stimuli like noise, physical contact, or the colour red. And his world is turned upside down when he's packed off from his home in Hamburg to his grandparents' house in the appropriately named Lunau, along with his elder sister and brother for their summer break when his mum accepts a month-long job opportunity in China. To help ease this sudden transition, his mum suggests that Tom treat his stay like a spacefaring adventure, a mission that takes on a new dimension when an asteroid seems headed for a potential crash course with the Earth's moon. Adapted by Sebastian Grusnick and Thomas Muller from their children's book of the same name, director Sarah Winkenstedt's touching coming-of-age comedy was awarded Best International Feature at the 2024 Kristiansand International Children's Film Festival. Greetings from Mars is a film with an out-of-this-world heart. But before we look at this film in more detail, I do want to return to the terminology and techniques that I flagged at the beginning of the presentation, and that real core focus on developing students' visual literacy skills. And so I would actually recommend to teachers that prior to attending the screening, it might be really useful to either introduce, depending on the age level of the students, or at least revise a selection of key film terminology and techniques that students should really be thinking about while they're watching the film. Because, and I realize I say this every year, it's crucially important to reinforce the need for students to actively engage with these films. Yes, they're entertaining. Yes, films are fun. But there also needs to be that expectation placed upon students that they'll be watching these films in order to analyse them. Whether that's as part of a non-English language course, or English, EAL, media, or a film studies unit. And on that, I would actually suggest that students take notes, or be encouraged to take notes during the screening. It's one way to ensure that they're going to be actively engaging with what they're seeing on screen. Now, I'll talk about some of these elements in relation to the specific film in more detail shortly, but just as a general overview of film techniques, something that might be beneficial prior to the screening, this might be a useful starting point. And look, there's no shortage of film resources online that can assist in that process, whether that's on YouTube or in, say, textbook form. I would also really emphasize from the outset that it's important that students can firstly identify the technique that's being used, that secondly, they can understand its general function in the context of film language and filmmaking, especially in terms of creating meaning within the film itself from a filmmaker's perspective. And then thirdly, that they can apply that knowledge to an analysis of the specific text in the context of the narrative, the characters, the themes and ideas that the film's exploring. And it's very difficult to achieve that final outcome unless those first two learning aims have been properly established and understood. And so with that in mind, some of the basic techniques that students should ideally be familiar with are things like cinematography, whether that's the close-up or a wide-angle shot or camera movement, the various components of mise-en-scène, which incorporates elements such as props, costumes, the use of lighting, the blocking of actors, the composition of the frame, where relevant, music and also lyrics, sound, dialogue, the use of voiceover, editing, narrative structure and story elements, and also visual motifs and symbolism. And so, as I mentioned, these are effectively the building blocks of filmmaking. So it's really essential, I think, that students have an awareness of these and come into the screenings with that awareness. So moving on to the film in a little more detail here. Just to give you an overview of the kinds of themes and issues that are explored within Greetings from Mars, you have things like family is obviously a really key focus here, as is neurodivergence or neurodiversity. Themes of ambition, of teamwork. Astronomy is a focus within the film through the character of Tom. You have questions about responsibility and obligations, which obviously links into some of these other themes like family. So too, obviously, the focus on intergenerational tensions. You also have these questions about coping with change, not just from Tom's perspective, but obviously that's at the forefront of the narrative, but also from the grandparents' perspective. And both of those, both Tom and all the other characters within the film, there is that element about dealing with grief over the loss of Tom's father. And across the film, you have that overarching theme of the coming of age. When I approach a film text with a class, I often like to start from the big picture and then gradually work in to the really focused scenic or filmic analysis. And there are a number of contexts that I think you could establish or lay a groundwork for the analysis of Greetings from Mars. So as I mentioned at the beginning, it's based on a well-known children's book. It was adapted by the same authors. So there's an element of adaptation. But a number of the other contexts, I think, link back to some of the themes that I've just mentioned in terms of neurodiversity, of grief, of separation, those kind of intergenerational themes. So there's scope within the kind of broader cultural and social themes, but also these other key elements that connect more specifically, I guess, to the German context in which the film was produced. So just as starting points, Wikipedia, again, not great for critical essays or references, great as starting points for research. So autism, questions about the exploration to Mars, that is obviously a preoccupation of Tom's within the film, and also geographical elements. So the grandparents live in Lunau, which is, I'm guessing, a clever play on words in terms of Tom's obsession with things space and the moon and the word lunar. Lunau is a forest in Germany. It's in the Saxony-Anhalt state. I've listed a link to that region if you want to use the film as a sort of an exploration for a regional focus on the particular area of Germany in which this film takes place. I've also listed a link to the Lunau forest on a map. You also have reference to Hamburg, which is where the family takes off from on their way to Lunau. One other context that I think is really beneficial for students, certainly for developing students' understandings about the creative process in film, how meaning is created by filmmakers, their intentions for a particular work, and the kind of contrast between what students might see, how they interpret a film, and what the intentions of the filmmakers were. You know, are they aligned? Are they different? Encouraging students to have different interpretations, but really using filmmakers' commentary about the work as either prompts or points of comparison to the students' own analysis of the films. And here I've listed a handful of interviews with the film's director, Sarah Winkenstedt, which could be incorporated into classroom discussion and really sort of bolster or deepen students' understandings of what she was setting out to do with the film. And as she explains in one of these interviews from Cine Europa, she says, "I really enjoy working for children because I think it's important to present them with stories that tell them about the reality of life in their own country or in their own world, steering clear of popcorn action cinema like Minions and the Pixar films. There's nothing better than sitting in a cinema full of children as you get to see their unfiltered reactions. I think every filmmaker should experience that. Children are a better audience than adults. Apart from that, I also enjoy working with children. It's very touching to see the joy they take in acting. However, you have to prepare children's roles very intensively because they are usually not able to help with the design of the characters or to give input in the same way as adult actors." Winkenstedt's point there about this film being perhaps different from the kind of quote-unquote popcorn action cinema that she mentions, I think is a really interesting one, and that would be an ideal prompt for students. Like, what are the kind of key points of comparison? What is the director getting at there? How does this film relate perhaps to the specifics of German culture as opposed to an American context for some of the films that she mentions? So these prompts and the kind of interviews with the creative figures involved with the film will allow for that broader discussion in that post-screening classroom context. For German language classes, there are also German language interviews available online. Again, those could be used as a sort of translation exercise or listening exercises, depending on the academic level of the students. Now, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, film techniques, terminology, understanding the kind of nitty-gritty, the nuts and bolts of filmmaking is a key part of developing those visual literacy skills. So here I think an important approach to this film has to involve an understanding of cinematography. Students should really consider how the film's cinematography, whether it's the types of shots, the use of focus, the use of different angles, compositions, camera movement, how does all of those elements shape our connection to the film or to the way in which the film explores various themes or characters. So let's take the close-up as an example. Here we have a close-up of Tom early on in the film. He's in, I guess, what you could call his sort of silent room, sort of sensory deprivation room where he feels comfortable. The filmmaker uses that extreme close-up to put us in his perceptual space, to really emphasize that identification with his character right from the beginning of the film. Also, the closed-off nature of the close-up adds to that sense of claustrophobia, perhaps, for him maybe sensing that the world is closing in on him. So again, thinking back to what I said at the beginning of the presentation, students should be able to identify the technique. That's a close-up. They should be able to understand its general function. Well, it's for filmmakers to foster that sense of intimacy or identification with characters, or to point out key details within the frame. And thirdly, the key one, to be able to apply that knowledge to the context in which it's being used. Well, okay, in this particular scene, that's my interpretation of why the filmmaker is using that approach. 1, 2, 3. It's a really simple approach, I think, to teaching film technique and meaning and analysis. Wide angles, by contrast, have a very different emotional connection for the audience. In this case, I'm sure you can barely see it, that little speck of white in the middle of the frame, that's an image of Tom in his sort of astronaut costume floating in space in one of the film's sort of fantasy sequences. So again, the use of the wide angle there exaggerates that sense of isolation, situates him in his sort of ideal sphere. So wide angles function in terms of setting, but they also have a sort of create a very different spatial relationship for the audience. And one of the techniques that Winkenstedt uses throughout this film is to keep the camera fairly low to the ground. So I think part of the reason for that, again, my interpretation, is that she's establishing this framework where the camera is aligned with Tom. You know, he's short, he's closer to the ground. We're encouraged to see the world from his perspective, which might explain why the camera is often lower to the ground. She uses a number of other techniques to create or emphasize this or foster this sense of identification. The use of the POV, or point of view shot, is a key one throughout the film as well, where the camera almost literally adopts Tom's perspective on the world. And here we have a shot where his mum's entered into his room looking in on him. Hey, big boy, are you all right? We're seeing the world through his eyes, this interaction with his mother. And she uses a similar technique here in terms of camera focus. So again, this is a conversation between Tom and his mother early on within the film, and she shifts focus from the mother who's speaking to his elder sister in the background. And I think I would encourage students to consider what she's doing or what she's achieving by this in terms of the way in which Tom is experiencing the world, where it's all almost happening all at once. It suggests a way in which Tom's relationship to his sort of sensory atmosphere or environment can't necessarily focus just on one element at once. It's constantly taking in this sensory information from all around him all at once. And lastly, I'd encourage students to consider the composition of various shots. And you'll notice that in both the bottom left and bottom right, she frames characters through doorways, both early on within the film, say in the Hamburg house, and later on with Tom and his sister in the Lunau grandparents' house. And again, how might students interpret that? Is that a sense of the world closing in on Tom? Does it emphasize a sense of claustrophobia? These are questions to put to students and see what kinds of interpretations that they might bring to the film and to the use of these particular techniques in the context of certain scenes. Another element in terms of the film's visual style is the use of animation. So asking students to consider, how does the film use other visual or stylistic techniques, such as animation, to convey aspects related to themes or characters? How do these techniques grant us that added layer of understanding or window into the minds and experiences of the characters, in particular the character of Tom? So we open with the sort of animated world, this mission shuttle circling around the Earth and Mars. But we get this flourishes of animation in other ways as well, where he colours his own world with animation, like we see in those bottom two images. On the drive to Lunau, he reimagines his world, his environment inside the car as a kind of space mission with his sister and his mother in the front. And we see the sort of trails of animation disappear as they arrive in Lunau. And as you can see in the subtitles there, we landed on Lunau at exactly 1:45 p.m. Time is a key motif throughout the film that I'll touch on a little bit later. But not always with that sort of hand-drawn style of animation. You'll notice in that image on the top right with the conversation between Tom and his mother, where she's describing what she has to do in terms of going to China. And we have this sort of sudden projection, almost like a mental projection image, these rapid images of China to reflect Tom's understanding of where she's headed. China has 1.4 billion inhabitants. It's 8,000 kilometers from us, and its national flag is red. Red's a key factor in this film as well. So there's a number of different techniques that Winkenstedt is using in order to situate the audience within Tom's perceptual space. And animation is obviously a key one. As she says in this Cine Europa interview, it was about showing Tom's perspective. We used the animations to visualize his dream world. These are the moments when he is doing well and when we see his idea of space. They symbolize his great talent for astronomical calculations. To express Tom's autism, we chose different elements to mimic a broken filter. Experts have explained to me that autistic people have no filter for perceiving the world. They see and hear everything equally. They do not prioritize. In order to visualize this, we thought about it for a long time and carried out many tests. We then decided in favor of so-called tilt and shift lenses. He sees things alternately in focus and out of focus, usually not what he should or wants to focus on. Again, going back to that previous slide and that image I showed, a perfect example of style and form connecting to both character and themes. So mise-en-scène is a concept that basically refers to everything within the frame of the film, including things like lighting, composition, props, the blocking of actors, the costumes that they're wearing. All of that visual design and production design conveying a sense of something, right? Creating meaning within the frame. So students really need to consider how the visual design of scenes or sequences or locations within the film convey meaning or shape meaning in terms of themes and characters. You know, what can we decipher about the characters or their emotional state or the world that they inhabit solely from the look of certain scenes or sequences, you know, irrespective of dialogue. And colour plays a significant role within this film. As Tom says right from the beginning, blue is my favourite colour. I do not like red. And then he has the qualifier, Mars isn't actually red, it's beige brown, which might explain his fascination with Mars. And you'll notice throughout the film the very careful selection of colours within the overall design of the mise-en-scène. So for instance, the top right image of Hamburg, there's almost no reds within the frame. There's blues, there's tans, there's beige browns. You know, they define the look of the set, they define the colour palette within the set. This is Tom's quote-unquote, I guess, safe space in a way. You could contrast that to Tom's silent room, the look, the mise-en-scène of that, the lighting and how that changes, but also to the sort of sparseness of it. Very clean lines, very ordered mise-en-scène. And then we contrast that to, say, the mise-en-scène of grandparents' house in Lunau. And you'll notice in one of those images we have a very stark painted red door with blue trim. Again, a key aspect within the narrative for the character of Tom. Or the chaos and clutter that we see in the bottom right image. Again, this use of contrasting mise-en-scène to contrast sort of the very controlled, orderly, safe space for Tom versus the challenges he encounters at Grandma and Grandpa's house. This is all being conveyed through the visual language, not just through the dialogue. Music, sound, and voiceover are also really key elements within the film. So asking students, you know, how does the film or filmmakers employ these oral techniques in order to give us a clearer understanding of Tom, his emotional or his sensory state? There's a really intricate sound design in this film, which I think captures exactly what Winkenstedt was referring to earlier. Students really need to consider the use of music or sound or silence and the way that aligns us with certain characters or their experiences. As she elaborates again in a different interview, one for The Spot, where she says, "I wanted to convey how a boy with autism spectrum disorder sees the world. That's only possible if you tell the story entirely from his perspective. For example, we were able to work with lines to convey how analytical his thinking is. He sees more, hears more, and isn't able to filter it all out as well. When people with ASD sit in a cafe, they hear the conversations at the next table and the next, as well as those of the person sitting across from them. They also hear the cars driving by outside, the clock ticking, the phone ringing. They're constantly bombarded with a maximum amount of information without being able to filter out what's essential for them. Crowded rooms are just as overwhelming for them as sudden, loud, unexpected things, both auditory and visual." Again, a perfect prompt to put to students and say, okay, where did you notice this in the film? How did you notice the way in which the filmmaker used techniques surrounding sound and music to convey that sensation that she's referring to? So I've mentioned autism a couple of times, and certainly this is obviously a key focus for the film. Depending on the age of the students and their awareness of ASD, autism spectrum disorder, I think this is a key context to educate about the condition. Now, there's another element here that I think could be incorporated into classroom discussion, and that is about representation of people who may have autism or autistic characters on screen. This is a conversation that has been increasing in recent decades about screen representation and the kinds of ethical issues to do with having non-neurodiverse people occupy roles for autistic characters. This is a can of worms I'm not going to dive into now, but it's certainly something you could touch on in classroom. And I've listed a couple of links there that deal specifically with questions about representation in relation to autistic characters on screen, such as Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man, Claire Danes in Temple Grandin, or more recently, Ben Affleck in The Accountant, or indeed The Accountant Part 2. Yes, they made a sequel. I think Winkenstedt's take on autism in terms of representation in this interview is also worth mentioning here. As she says, "We were wondering whether or not we should say that Tom has autism at all. We then decided not to say it until the end." Sorry, spoiler. Because that's how it is in life. We meet people and perhaps find them odd or think they react strangely. Often, we never find out why they do that. I wanted the audience to dive into this film, watch this boy, and not have a diagnosis for him straight away. It was important to me that children could first think for themselves about why he was doing certain things. That stimulates the imagination. We decided to say that he's autistic at the end, also because this opens up the possibility that the audience might look more closely into the topic and develop an interest for people who are affected. Another reason why this is such an ideal text for teaching. So the theme of astronomy. Tom's fascination with astronomy is evident throughout the film. I would ask students, why might Tom have such a strong interest in all things space? In what ways is his interest, say, in Mars connected to his autism diagnosis? But how else might we interpret this fascination with space? Is it aspirational? Does it sort of symbolize his desire to transcend his condition? Is it indicative of his age? A young boy obsessed with space or dinosaurs or Lego, whatever kids think about these days. Does it reflect just his desire for isolation, like we see him in his silent room at the beginning of the film? Or could it be connected to his grief over the loss of his father? As with any film in the MIFF Schools program, students should be encouraged to consider a range of potential interpretations. And once again, you could defer back to Winkenstedt as a prompt to further students' understandings on the theme of astronomy. In terms of key motifs related to astronomy, obviously, the motif of the asteroid. Asteroid 2024 NR7 is a key focus within the narrative. On one hand, you can say, okay, we can take the plot element of the asteroid literally, but how else might we interpret this astronomical event and its importance within Tom's sort of quote-unquote lunar mission, or the way that his endeavours to discover the asteroid's whereabouts parallel that personal coming of age? Again, I think students should consider how these dual aspects of the narrative serve either a structural, thematic, or dramatic function within the film. As that previous quote by Winkenstedt sort of alluded to, the identity or form of the asteroid / comet alters over the course of the film. Could the same be said for Tom? In what ways is this search for the asteroid potentially connected to Tom's deceased father? And here I think students should consider the symbolism of props within the film, such as Tom's use of Martin, his deceased father's old telescope, to track the celestial object. I don't think it's a coincidence that these elements within the film are aligned. I mentioned the theme of grief early on. So in what ways does the film explore grief? Aside from the dialogue, obviously, what visual strategies does the director employ in order to convey that sense of loss or separation or absence within the film? How does the film develop this theme towards the resolution? Is there an emotional coming to terms that takes place? And beyond that, how do or have the differing characters emotionally responded to that loss? And again, mise-en-scène is key here. We have an image of Tom's father in his silent room, this little photo of him dressed up as an astronaut. We have photos of his father in the grandparents' house. We have discoveries that are made in the attic regarding Martin. We have shots in the film that suggest a kind of isolation or separation between his grandparents in one particular key sequence within the film. And a number of references in the dialogue as well. Each character, I think, is dealing with grief and loss, not just Tom, and the film covers it from a number of different perspectives. Which in a way leads us to the broad theme of family. And like I just mentioned in relation to grief, I think you could approach this theme not simply through the perspective or the lens of Tom, but through each individual family member and how they each perhaps see their responsibilities or roles within the family, and how do they each respond to this unexpected predicament. Obviously, Tom is a key part of that conversation, but the grandparents as well, or even Tom's elder siblings as well. And I think we start to see this idea of family change over the course of the narrative, and asking students to pinpoint the kind of key turning points for those characters I think would be important. Or even the way that the narrative frames Tom's ability to cope with this change through the lens of the mission, as he keeps repeating to himself, I just have to manage Grandma and Grandpa, then I can go to Mars. There are a number of other key visual motifs and forms of symbolism in the film that I think students could pinpoint or look at, or could be brought up in class discussion. Watches and references to time, I mentioned that earlier. Food is another key element. Hands, or beyond that, the kind of symbolism of physical contact, physical connection. Forms of transport, this sort of involves a number of other characters, including Horst's camper van. We have questions raised about technology, the elder sister's annoyance that there's no phone signal or internet at Grandma and Grandpa's place. How does technology play into this experience that they undergo? There's also an interesting subtext in terms of bodies, which comes into play at a couple of points within the narrative. And I would definitely press students on how they responded to that, or how they interpret that. And for me, I think part of it is this process of normalizing difference. We see that through grandfather who gets his kid off. We don't see anything. It's very tastefully done, and then heads into the local lake. But these references to bodies and physical appearance, I think, runs parallel in a way to the film's approach to autism and people with ASD. We also have nods to the logbook, which becomes integral, and I think you could ask students to consider what its significance or role is in terms of Tom and his coping mechanisms, and also, of course, rules, and how these ideas of rules and regimented times and everything must be controlled to the nth degree begin to change as Tom acclimatizes perhaps to his new surroundings. So lots in here to unpack. And without giving anything away, what impression does Winckenstedt leave us with at the end of the film? So what's the tone of the ending? Is there a sense of resolution and optimism, or are there questions about the various characters' future that are left open? Why might the director have chosen to employ a direct-to-camera look at the end of the film? So why does Tom kind of break that fourth wall by looking down the barrel of the camera right at the audience? What do you think what are some reasons potentially why the filmmaker chose that approach at the very end of the film? And once again, a range of interpretive possibilities should be wholeheartedly encouraged. And I kind of like this quote from Winckenstedt, as she says, "Cinema also has to be a little larger than life. After the first screenings, I asked the children who thought Tom would become an astronaut. Almost all of them raised their hands. That was a nice reward. Then I knew my efforts had paid off. You should leave the cinema feeling elated, not convinced that the film just pulled the wool over your eyes. Looking back, I'm pleased we succeeded." Is that the impression the students left with? Certainly the impression I left with. And lastly, in terms of a potential assessment task that incorporates a lot of the elements that I've just referred to, asking students to critically engage with published reviews of the film and then ideally responding by writing their own, whether in German for German language courses or for English, media English literature classes, is certainly one possible and useful approach, so long as students are encouraged to utilize the kinds of techniques and terminology and critical strategies that I've touched on throughout this presentation. I've provided a link to one such review, which I think is useful. This is from Thomas Schultz, writing for The Spot, where he writes, "Sarah Winkenstedt's films aren't often shown in cinemas, and that's a shame. After all, the filmmaker already demonstrated in 2018's Too Far Away how sensitively she directs, how empathetic her view of her childhood heroes is, and how closely she delves into the emotional worlds of boys this age, before puberty sets in, yet still slowly beginning to shed childhood. So let's rejoice in Greetings from Mars, which plays to the particular strengths of the director." And with that, we have reached the end of the presentation. For information regarding bookings, age suitability, or additional details for all of the films in this year's MIFF Schools program, head on over to miff.com.au/schools, where you will find all the information and resources, as well as links to the rest of this year's festival program and screenings. And so, on behalf of myself, Josh Nelson, and MIFF Schools programmer Kate Fitzpatrick, we'd like to thank you for watching this presentation and to wish you a very enjoyable and, more importantly, educationally rewarding experience at this year's film festival. Thanks so much.